You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible.
A disturbing new video has hit the internet showing yet another unarmed black teen being abused by law enforcement. Now, the Baton Rouge Police Department is investigating the arrest of a 13-year-old black boy who was put into a chokehold by one of its officers. As an audience of teenagers pled for the officer to stop, the video shows the officer lying on top of the boy with his arm firmly locked around his neck. Two teenagers were arrested after the escapade, and one was charged with battery of a police officer. Members of the community are requesting for the body cam footage to be made public, while Baton Rouge's mayor called the incident concerning. Take a look at this video. At this time, no disciplinary actions have been put forward for these officers. I want to bring my panel back in. Robert, I feel like, once again, we have these conversations time and time again where we see an officer, whether it be a resource officer or an officer from the city's department, doing something to minority kids. Why do we continue to have these conversations?
Well, a few reasons, and any longtime viewer of our Wednesday panel knows, I have a fictional young girl that I like to bring out in situations like this named Lily White. So imagine that instead of being a 13-year-old black boy, that was a 13-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girl in a cheerleading or a Girl Scout outfit when a headlock by a police officer. What would be America's response to that? Will we just be talking about that on Roland Martin Unfiltered, or would that be on the front page of the New York Times? Would that be on leading every cable news broadcast? Would Nancy Grace and Laura Ingraham be broadcasting live from the scene? Oh, and let it have been a big black police officer choking out Lily White on the street. I'm pretty sure they would have helicoptered in everybody to make sure that she was well taken care of, because I think they're still looking for Natalie Hollowell till this day. We have to understand that in this country, you have a couple concepts working concurrently. You have the concept of age overestimation. That is a sociological construct where white people, when they see a black child, do not see a black child. It's been shown in study after study. You know, we all know the doll test done by sociologists. The overestimation test, they'll show white people pictures of black children, you know, ages 8 till 15 years old. And then generally the responses will come back and they'll ask them, how old is this child or this person? They'll say 20, 25, 30 sometimes, depending on the child. Particularly the darker the child, the older they think that they are. So often when police officers are interceding with our children, just as we saw in the Tamir Rice case, they're not interceding with a child. They don't view them with the same way that they would see Lily White. They see them as a large, aggressive black man who needs to be subdued, the same way those first Dutchmen who got off that boat in West Africa saw the Mandinka tribe and figured out they needed to fight these dudes off. That's what they are seeing when they see our young black boys, and they feel they need to choke them and fight them. Also, we have to deal with the concept of overcriminalization. White kids can just have a fight and just go home to their parents, and then they talk about the fight. And that's all that happens. And guess what? If the cops come, they'll say, hey, don't be out here fighting. And they'll send them home to their parents. Black kids get put in chokeholds. They get put into the back of police cars. They get handcuffs put on them. They get into the criminal justice system. They get put into alternative schools and then get fed into the school to prison pipeline going forward. So something like a shoplifting case or a schoolyard fight now turns into a Class C felony on their record, which prevents them from applying to law school in 15 years. So we have to overall look at the way the system looks at young African Americans and then normalize being black in this country so but your blackness itself is not seen as an imprimatur of evil in some kind of way. You might as well have a Hydra logo or an Al-Qaeda sticker on sometimes to these officers when they see your black skin. So until we can address this implicit bias within policing, we'll continue to have these issues. And it's going to take training. It's going to take a recognition of the problem, because all you hear whenever you talk about these things, even if you talk to the officers, they'll be sincere and say, well, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I got a black dog at home. So how can I be racist? In reality, what you have to understand is breaking down implicit bias in the system is the only way to prevent these things from happening going forward.
And like you're saying, Robert, normalizing blackness, which is something that should be a given, but it's something that needs to happen. And of course, you mentioned the case of Tamir Rice, and those officers simply said they thought he was an adult. They thought that Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, was a man. But we see this time and time again where young African Americans in school or outside of school are being targeted by officers. And after what took place with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the protests here in this nation around the world, authorities in schools here in the nation have decided to try to remove officers from school, but this wouldn't have mattered for this case with this young man. So, Scott, what do you have to say to what Robert said there?
Well, I agree with Robert, but it's deeper than that. They don't see us. They don't see us as human beings. They treat dogs, dogs better than they treat young black men and women. They don't see us. Because if you saw me as a young black man or young black woman, 9 years old, 13 years old, you saw me as a child. You wouldn't be putting me in a chokehold and making out like I've got a gun and I'm a threat to your life as a police officer. Who are we giving guns and badges to? How come we're not doing psychological evaluations at the training level, at the cadet level, to see whether you are racist or whether you escalate versus de-escalate, whether you want to be a police officer for the wrong reason? And then do that on an annual basis. Find money to do that, because as long as you don't see me as human, as long as you don't see me as a law-abiding citizen, as long as you don't see me as having a mental health episode, right, you're just going to keep applying force, because you got to choose police officers who aren't like that. Because Tennessee v. Garner says you can't use deadly force on a nonviolent fleeing felon, and we continue to see these videos. It's not the laws. You can pass whatever law you want until the police and who you hire and who has a gun and a badge and has judgment on whether to use deadly force or de-escalation measures, you're going to continue to see black men and women killed and abused and brutalized by black people, by police officers. It's just a fact. I guarantee you, next month, maybe next week, we're going to be talking about more videos of more police officers abusing more black people, not just in the South. It'll be in the North, the East, the West, and we're talking about passing laws, and I guess that gets you accountability. But until you fix who you're putting on these police forces, right? Until you fix the police unions, they won't see us.
And Scott,
and as long as they don't see us, they're going to kill us and abuse us.
And I agree with you, Scott. I mean, to your point, they'd have to gut out an entire system, right? A system, as we know, is extremely corrupt. And there have been people who have said the same thing as you said, where there needs to be a vetting process. Let's see how racist these people really are, or what their intentions are when it comes to being on the force. But I've heard authorities say that if they were to do that, they'd have nobody on the force. So essentially, they're afraid of losing the officers that they do have at the expense of people who look like you and me. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, that sounds like a personal problem and a cop-out. Because if you're not going to do that, then you must have accountability. If you use deadly force inappropriately, if you don't turn on your camera as a police officer, you ought to be disciplined. You ought to be, your paycheck ought to be docked. Your pension ought to be at risk. You ought to be in danger of losing your job. If these police officers are very serious about cleaning up their ranks, and I'm not just talking about the bad actors, because I don't want to hear about bad actors. Because if you know you work with a bad actor and you don't report them, you're complicit in their bad act.
Yep.
And so until we decide that we're going to clean up these police forces, then it's just going to continue. You watch. Next month, we're going to be talking about another situation.
Unfortunately, you're probably right there. Now, Monique, we have you back. Is there anything you want to say in regards to this story?
I'm sick of it. I don't have anything.
I agree.
Content-wise that can be added that hasn't already been said, except maybe this. When we talk about just the dehumanization of the Black body, I think I am concerned about now the role that all this footage and all of these videos that turn millions of people at a time into eyewitnesses. I am concerned about the role that is having in further dehumanization, because they fear and are threatened by our presence to begin with. But now people are used to seeing us choked. They're used to seeing us shot in the back. They're used to seeing us drowned. They're used to seeing us body slammed. And while I understand the necessity, because it's not enough to have eyewitnesses when it's Black folks, you have to have 1 million witnesses who march on Congress and march down Main Street in order for anything to be done. But I am bothered by the other effects of this constant loop that we now have of violence against us.
Robert, before we move on, is there anything you want to say? I think, Scott, you were trying to sneak in there.
Well, one thing, I'll just piggyback on what Scott says, and this is why I never understand with the police officers and the unions in particular. They always say, well, it's just a couple of bad apples. But play that saying out all the way. Nobody says one bad apple, don't worry about it, things will be fine, it's just one. They say one bad apple will spoil the bunch. So if you're not rooting out that one bad apple, it spreads, it metastasizes, it becomes entrenched in your department, entrenched in the police unions, entrenched in the way that we teach policing in this country. So much so there wasn't but a couple years ago, President Trump was saying, rough them up a little bit when you put them in the car, don't cradle their heads. That's the way that many people see themselves. If you go into many of these police chat groups, and we've had to do so in Discovery for police violence cases here in Georgia before, they all are obsessed with superheroes and comic book characters and the Punisher. They see themselves as being the thin blue line to subjugate and keep these Black communities down, because if you don't, then they'll start spilling over and interrupting the white communities. We're going through that right here in Atlanta, where people are losing their minds because, oh no, the Black people are starting to rob folks in Lenox and in Buckhead and in Sandy Springs. Been robbing folks in the Bluff for 30 years, been robbing folks on down in the squats for 30 years. They don't care about that there, because they see their job as the thin blue line to separate the wild poor people from the rich folks and their domestic tranquility. And until you root those bad apples out of the bunch, is going to poison the entire basket.
Scott, final words.
And you see that 9-year-old, if you run back to that video, you could hardly see this little 9-year-old. He wasn't a big kid. And this cop is on top of him, choking him. You could hardly see the kid. He couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, maybe. And when they don't see you, they do things like that to you.
All right, folks, back to that Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
It's time to be smart. When we control our institutions, we win. This is the most important news show on television of any racial background. Y'all put $2, $3, $4, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30 on this and keep this going. What you've done, Roland, since this crisis came out in full bloom. Anybody watching this, tell your friends. Go back and look at the last 2 weeks, especially of Roland Martin Unfiltered. I mean, hell, go back and look at the last 2 days. You've had sitting United States senators today, Klobuchar and Harris. Whatever you have that you can bring to Roland Martin Unfiltered to support it, please do, because this information may literally save your life.
Watch Roland Martin Unfiltered daily at 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, or go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.